Okay, so we're back in Gospel of John, trial of Jesus before Pilate, and when we were looking at things last time, um, Pilate had some disturbing news be brought to him. And it wasn't so much disturbing for the Jews who were bringing it to Pilate, but it was disturbing for Pilate because the Jews were saying that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Now, for Jews who believe in one God, and there being only one God, this is unconcerning to them because they're like, oh, well, this guy's just a nut. He is, or a blasphemer, because God can have no son because he is just one. Whereas for Pilate, whose religion is, you have these gods, these men who became gods, these people who mated with gods, and you have other smaller gods. This is very disturbing for Pilate, who is very much open to the concept of Jesus being the son of a god, whatever that happens to mean for him, or whatever he's reasoning in his head. So we left off last time with the exchange of Pilate with Jesus on that, where Pilate's trying to figure this out, and Jesus doesn't really answer his question, which is kind of par for the course for Jesus, because he's trying to point to something more important. So in John 19, and I do want to give us a little bit of context. So we'll actually be, well, I'll talk a little bit about verse 11 again, but we'll be starting with verse 12, but I do want to get a little bit of context in here. So how about we go to verse 7, we begin in verse 7, and then we'll, yeah, let's go to verse 12. So we'll go 7 to 12. Anybody would like to read?
The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin."
We're going to verse 12.
Oh, I'm sorry. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who has made himself a king opposes Caesar."
Okay. So we have a little bit of context there, going back to what we were talking about last week. And we were finishing off verse 11. So I'll just mention one thing that I neglected to mention last week, as we were going very much over time last week. But we were talking a little bit about, well, greater sin. Is there greater sin, lesser sins? And we could say yes in terms of, if you will, quality of sin rather than quantity. So yes, we could definitely say, well, killing somebody is obviously worse than slapping them in the face. Like there's different degrees there. However, they're both sins and they're both warranting of punishment. Oh, actually, I should mention one more thing in relation to that. So, so we could try to scale sins. I don't know what type of scale you would really have. So you could try to say slap. I'll put insult here because Jesus says, but if you insult somebody, if you call them you fool or something along those lines, that is breaking the fifth commandment because you're going against their person. And I don't know, I'll put injury there, and we can say way on this side is murder. So we could say that any of these are sins, but you still have this boundary which actually makes it sin. So in terms of qualitative analysis, so we're looking at the quality, like we can definitely measure the severity, but a sin is still a sin. So if it is a sin, it is by definition rebellion against God. rebellion against God. So with any sin, no matter how severe, it is fundamentally breaking apart the plan God has for the universe. Even going back to eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, like that's a trespass. So you could say, well, there's forbidden fruit in my neighbor's yard. Like I'm not allowed to eat that, but then you just transgress over the fence and then you grab that and you eat it. Like you're like, well, that's not a very big sin nowadays. And if you try to put that back in context of Garden of Eden and say like, yeah, just eating this forbidden fruit, like that's not a very big deal. However, it was a very big deal, and that's what Eve and the serpent were talking about, because the serpent was trying to convince her like, no, you'll be like God, you'll know good and evil. You'll be able to legislate for yourself the laws of the universe, because God said don't do this. But if you do this, then you're saying that you can do this. You're allowed by your own personal laws that you can go against God. So it's much bigger than just eating a piece of fruit. So any sin would be a rebellion against God, and even something as simple as transgressing to get a forbidden fruit, that is breaking apart the universe, and all sin goes bottlenecks back to that one sin in the Garden of Eden. Every other sin is deriving from that. So we can say that yes, any sin is fundamentally against God's perfect design, and once you break a perfect design, that is the entirety of the design is broken. Sure, certainly just in like one little respect over here, but the entirety of the design is no longer perfect. There's an imperfection. So yes, this needs to be managed. Question? Anything?
Is it, was it a rebellion when Eve took the fruit,
Yes.
or was it disobedient?
There's not exactly a difference in the sense that being disobedient is rebelling against the one who is given the law.
Yeah.
So if you're disobedient in saying this law does not apply to me, that is rebellion in the sense that you are no longer looking to the authority figure to say that you get to have authority over me. Yeah. So yeah, that's more the point with this guy. So it was a disobedient act towards, say, the particular law, don't eat of this fruit. But in a larger sense, yeah, it is rebellion. Yeah. Okay. So Jesus says, the one who has handed me over to you, to Pilate, is guilty of a greater sin. And we could also try to do this in terms of like a sliding scale, in terms of something more along the lines of justice. So this would actually be more fourth commandment. So this is fifth commandment. So with fourth commandment, well, who's in the proper authority? So Pilate, like he has to exercise some laws over Jesus because he's in authority over that area. So if Pilate crucifies Jesus, so Pilate crucifies Jesus. And I don't know where exactly this would be on a sliding scale. Like if you crucify Jesus, that's the worst thing you can do because you're killing God. But Pilate would be guilty of some sort of sin, but he's still not a Jew. He doesn't know the prophecies backwards and forwards like the Jews would. And Jesus, who's been fulfilling prophecy after prophecy after prophecy in their presence, like obviously they should know who he is, but Pilate does not have that context. What Pilate does have is Pilate has the discernment to say Jesus is not guilty, and yet crucifies Jesus anyways. So obviously Pilate is abusing his authority. So Pilate is not off the hook with regards to sin. But as for the Jews crucifying Jesus, this is way on the other side, or I should probably put way on the other side there. Because when the Jews crucify Jesus, they are definitely crucifying the one who's making all the claims in conformity with the Old Testament prophecies, which they should know backwards and forwards. Backwards and forwards. I'll stab myself with a felt pen. Okay. So yes, they are guilty of a greater sin. But it's interesting the word choice that Jesus has here. So he uses the term handed me over, or another way to translate that is betray. Those who have betrayed me over to you. So you have the Jews. You also have the Sanhedrin. The high priest. So he is the official head. So the Sanhedrin is the official head of the religion of Israel, so they should know better. The high priest also has responsibility to make sure everything goes right in terms of the religion. So they would be creating, they would be committing a greater sin than average Joseph Blow. I was going to say Joe Blow, but Joseph Blow, Jew. Joseph Blow, Jew, like he would know quite a bit of this stuff, but he's not the one responsible for identifying the Messiah. He's responsible, of course, for following the Messiah, which a lot of the Jews are doing. But yeah, they're then turning their back on Jesus. Like the Sanhedrin would be worse off because they're right there. They should know everything, and from all the testimony that they've heard, they should know exactly who Jesus is. And this is the fourth commandment issue. So fourth commandment, honor your father and mother, which is also the basis of government. So them as authorities, having some sort of governance, they're trying to maintain their authority instead of handing it over to the true Messiah. And that comes up in John chapter 11. So they're not acting the part that they need to. And then I'd say even further over for a betrayer is Judas. Because, well, Judas, I don't know if I would really put him in fourth commandment. He'd be more first, second, third. Because those are the commandments towards God. But Judas is the betrayer. And unlike the Sanhedrin, who have heard many stories about Jesus, Judas had firsthand, I should put Judas Iscariot, because there's a few Judases. Judas Iscariot, okay. He's had firsthand experience with Jesus for about 3 years now. He knows. He absolutely does. Like the disciples, yeah, there's always a bit of confusion here and there exactly what's going on. But Judas, like he knows this guy is the person that he should be looking to. He was also there when Peter had his confession that Jesus is the Christ, that is the Messiah. And Jesus says, "Blessed be you, Peter Bar Jonah, for this was not revealed to you but by my Father in heaven." So Judas, having also heard that and understanding that, like he should know. Yeah, he would be the greatest sin out of this whole thing. Then, of course, would definitely be the Sanhedrin, who should be leading the people in the fullness of faith, and they're leading the people away in faith, so they're not doing their proper duty in leadership. Then you also have the average Jew who's kind of making that spiritual discernment for themselves and rejecting Christ. But yes, when Jesus says, the ones who are handing me over to you are guilty of a greater sin, you know, we're seeing those who are handing Jesus over are definitely guilty of greater sins, because Pilate, he doesn't know. He doesn't have that. Makes sense. Yeah. Any questions?
But Pilate's sin in my eyes is great
Yeah.
because he isn't doing his job. He finds no fault with him, yet he hasn't crucified. So how does he justify that?
By trying to wash his hands of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so this doesn't come up in John. That actually comes up in Matthew, where Pilate washes his hands. So John doesn't really. It'd be too strong to say that John doesn't care about that event. Most likely, John doesn't see it as important.
Mhm.
Because John's focus in his gospel is, at this point in time anyways, is to look at who is the legitimate authority and what are the legitimate authorities actually doing. And with the authorities, mainly the Sanhedrin and Pilate, and the high priest, because he's bringing up Annas.
Yeah.
It's the high priest. I'll write in Annas and Caiaphas. So John's focus is, well, who are the legitimate authorities? What are they doing? And in thus seeing what they are doing, he's pointing out, well, who has the true pure authority? Who has the true leadership? And that would be pointing to Jesus, whose kingdom is not of this world. This world is falling into sin all over the place. So Jesus' kingdom is actually better. Jesus is a better king. And Jesus, when he's hinting at God the Father here, because he's saying that Pilate has no authority except from above. So he's pointing to God the Father. So Jesus is saying, well, I have the true legitimate authority because I have my kingdom, and the one who is above me, the Father, he has the true purest authority. So you guys just abuse your authority. Anyway, so yeah, that's John's focus. But Pilate, on a more personal note with him, so he at least is trying to work around things. So it's not as though people bring up a political prisoner to him and he goes, sure, yeah, I'll crucify this random guy. But he's actually trying to do his duty. He knows Jesus is guiltless. And he's trying to present opportunities to set Jesus free. So Pilate is trying, but if he... Oh, actually, okay, so let's bring this back to something that Jesus said. So Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then my officers, my soldiers, would fight for it. And Pilate is not seeing that anymore. Which is one of the reasons why he thinks Jesus is not guilty of insurrection, because Jesus isn't leading an army to try and take down worldly powers. So obviously Jesus is not claiming the kingdom of this world, but another world. Okay. So with that in mind, oh shoot, no, my train of thought, where were you? No, train of thought, come back. So Jesus, kingdom of this world. Okay. So Pilate, when he's looking at his worldly responsibility, his worldly responsibility is the army, is the soldiers, is the office holders. And he can also see that if Jesus is guiltless, then this worldly power, the Sanhedrin, because they're kind of forsaking their divine responsibilities. So this worldly power is not fulfilling their side. So Pilate actually does have a responsibility to bring forth the powers at his disposal. So Pilate at this time actually does have the ability and potential to start off a civil war in Israel. Because what he could do is he could forcibly release Jesus, give him an armed guard to make sure that he makes it out of Jerusalem. And that would lead to a rebellion of the Jews against the Roman governors, and his soldiers. There we go. At which point, Pilate would have to bring in a legion and take down any Jewish forces that are not allying themselves with Jesus. And there could actually be people like Peter who would raise up a sword and go like, I'll fight for Jesus. Let's take down these unbelievers. But Pilate is now weighing, do I want to bring about war with the Jews, or do I sacrifice one man for the good of the people, which was the reason that Caiaphas had. Let's sacrifice Jesus so that we don't tip off a war with the Romans. So, as St. John says, that he prophesied in the office of high priest, not exactly knowing what he was actually saying that Caiaphas is prophesying, let one man be sacrificed for the good of the people. So rather than a full-on war, let's have Christ sacrifice.
I still kind of, I know Jesus made the comment about the greater sin, and it seems a very human thing to do, to rate sin.
Yes.
But isn't it a bit of a red herring? I mean, once you cross that rebellion against God line, the death is the constant, like, so often it's used as an excuse. Well, I'm not as bad as the other guy because
that would be a red herring. Yes.
Yeah.
I was trying to say, like, it wouldn't be a red herring depending on the question, because if we're considering, well, let's say we're tempted to do something, and somebody in their temptation, they're tempted to do some great sin, but they withhold themselves, but in the process they're committing the smaller sin. From a practical perspective, it's like, well, no, yeah, obviously you want to choose the lesser of two evils. Like that still doesn't mean that you're free from guilt because you committed an evil, even though it's lesser. So you still want to pray for forgiveness. But yeah, it is a bit of a red herring if we want to say, well, if we're just weighing sin, it's still sin. But from a practical side, this was one of the more famous sayings of Luther, and ones that people frequently try to misquote him on. But Luther's right-hand man, Melanchthon, he was trying to deal with a pastoral issue. And Melanchthon was saying, well, I only see these ways out of it. And I can't remember exactly what the issue was, but Melanchthon is saying, I see these ways out, and sin lies with each path. He just could not see a way out of a particular situation without some sort of sin being committed. And what Luther did in response to Melanchthon was say, okay, well then choose the lesser sin. And then when people are trying to misquote Luther, they kind of stop it after that and say, like, say Luther wanted people to sin. It's like, no, that's not what he said. Because he actually added on there. And pray. Because Luther is saying, well, it's better to choose the lesser of two evils. And from a very practical point of view, we agree. But Luther is also admitting this is an evil, we need to pray for forgiveness. Because we don't see another way out, so we're choosing the lesser evil, falling to our knees before God and saying, I can't see any way out. This is what I have, this is what I'm choosing. Please, Lord, forgive me for choosing this thing. That's the proper Christian response. But if we're just trying to, but yeah, we shouldn't let Pilate off the hook, nor should we let Jews, nor the Sanhedrin, nor Judas off the hook. Like they all have to come to terms with their sin, and they all have to seek repentance. Now, what Pilate is trying to do is he's trying to let himself off the hook, in the sense that he's washing his hands of it. He's saying, yes, I'm giving this order, but I don't want to take responsibility for this. So in Matthew's gospel, the Jewish crowd responds and says, well, let his blood be on us and on our people, on our children. Sorry. So yes, this is why we say the Jews killed Jesus. And then people also abuse that idea by trying to just attack Jews willy-nilly, even though the early Christians were Jews. So it's not a race thing. Not remotely. And even in the modern day, like the Nazis tried to bring this back and say, see, the Jews killed Jesus, therefore we have to kill Jews. And then some people are like, let's do that. And again, not a good thing. Because that's racializing something that shouldn't be racialized. So the Jews who were rejecting Jesus were the ones, yes, they do have his blood on their heads. But how are we cleansed from sin?
Jesus' death.
Jesus' death, where he
Yes,
shed,
Pardon?
where he shed his
Blood.
yes. So when Jesus washes us with his blood, we are cleansed with sin. So do we want the blood of Christ on us? Yes. Yes. So for the Jews, like, yeah, we don't want to see this as some sort of racial bigotry where we have some sort of excuse to hate them. But they're the ones who were God's chosen people. Jesus came from the Jews. So we definitely want them saved by the blood of Christ rather than the blood of Christ, rather speaking in judgment against them because they're rejecting Jesus, rejecting faith. So the promise is still for them. Anyways. Yeah. Okay. Going. Okay. I have to backtrack to myself. Okay. So I was digressing. So Pilate, yeah, Pilate is trying to let himself off the hook. He's trying to wash his hands of it. The Jews try to take responsibility. But when Jesus is saying there's a greater sin committed, he's implying that Pilate will still be guilty of something. Like he's not guilty of the greatest sin. He probably should have come up to the point of defying the Jews to protect Jesus, but he doesn't do that. But this is also going according to God's plan because he places people where they need to be. So he knew Pilate wouldn't let Jesus completely off the hook. Pilate would cave in some way and be guilty of sin. And who knows? Hopefully Pilate converted before he died. Most likely not, from some of the sources that we have, say, in the book of Acts. But we can always hope. Anyways, so God knew that Pilate would act the way that he did. He also knew that Judas, given the opportunity, would act the way that he did, as well as the people who were playing high priest that year. So God placed people where they needed to be to ensure that Jesus would be sacrificed. So whereas there might have been more perfectly moral people who would have taken up the governorship and actually let Jesus go, Pilate did not. Questions, call. Yes.
Yes, he could not, because if he maybe followed his instinct or his heart or whatever, he would have seen as rebelling against Caesar, and that would have been putting him in a real grave situation, naturally.
Yeah, so let's get to that. Because that is going to be the response, or the call and response that Pilate has with the people. So we have Jesus' statement in verse 11, guilty of a greater sin. And then we have in verse 12, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. And let's see, I think did I have a note? Nope. Okay, I did not have a specific note about that. But then the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. So we don't have an exact action as to what Pilate is doing. Most likely he's going back to the crowd and he's trying to appeal to the crowd, hey, let's let this Jesus guy go. Most likely that's what's going on. Because because we could imagine a situation where Pilate just sends Jesus out a back door or escape hatch or something, and Jesus is free. But no, that's probably not what's happening. It's probably just Pilate trying to appeal to the Jews again, because if they're giving a response, then most likely Pilate's talking about them. Okay, so the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Um, let's see. Continuous view. Oh. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. So something with the grammar, which you can't really see in English. Hey, NIV, you're doing this wrong. What on earth? Yeah. So that's a participle, but that's what on earth are you doing, NIV? Okay. Yeah, I don't know why the NIV is doing this. Okay.
What verse are you speaking of, or what line are you saying?
Verse 12. NIV is doing something weird with the translation.
What is it? I have a different translation, I think, than you, maybe.
Ah, okay, that's so. Okay, that's what the NIV is interpreting that as. Okay. So the NIV has reduced 2 words to 1, and that's why this is very confusing for me. So sorry, Nancy, what do you have?
From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out. Is that what you're talking about?
Well,
If
there's
if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend.
well, there's 2 words in there that for the Jews. So Pilate was because the word for Pilate there, his action is seeking, and that's in the Greek imperfect, which means that that's kind of a continuous action. And the Jews, they respond with they cried out saying. So cried out is what's called finite verb. So it happened. There's one time that it happened. But the next word is a participle, so that's an ing verb, and that could imply that this was an ongoing response, that they were doing this again and again and again. But yeah, I I I don't think I would fully agree with the NIV's translation of kept shouting. That doesn't make sense to me. Most likely that they were shouting, that they shouted. So they had one action against what Pilate was kept trying to do. And it was a singular, so every time Pilate tried to create a new appeal to the people, most likely what they were doing was they gave this one response. So anything Pilate said, they gave this response. Okay. So yes, sorry, I was just being confused because there's 2 words in Greek that the NIV is translating as one. It confuses me.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused here because it says they shouted, take him away, crucify him.
Oh, that's in verse 15 instead of verse 12. Right?
15, yeah. And then Pilate asked, shall I crucify your king?
Mhm.
But then in the end, in verse 16, it says, finally Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified.
Mhm.
And up there it says, shall I crucify your king?
Mhm.
So there's a difference there. Handed him over to them. Does that mean to the Jewish?
Yep.
But they could not crucify. It had to be
Yes, they
the
could.
soldier, or no?
Well, we'll get to that when we get to that. So we'll go back to verse 12.
Okay.
So we'll go through the thought process and rising action. So what the Jews are trying to make the claim for is they're now challenging Pilate's position and authority. So Jesus had just said that in verse 11, Pilate has no authority unless it was given to you from above. So Jesus saying, ultimately, your authority, Pilate, is from God. And now the Jews are trying to say, well, your authority depends on Caesar. So that's a big step down from God. So Jesus is trying to say, okay, look to this authority, and the Jews are trying to say, look to that. So what the Jews are trying to do is they're trying to look more towards worldly authorities versus the heavenly authority. But they've also just created a new claim against Jesus, saying he claimed to be a heavenly authority, so let's just look, but now they're looking at worldly authorities. Let's concentrate on that. So very interesting. And this will have major claims in verse 15, which we'll hopefully get to in a second. Okay. Sorry, look, just glancing from my notes to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Oh yeah, so with this claim of being no friend to Caesar, obviously they're going back to the original claim of he committed insurrection. He's going against Caesar, so you have to kill him for Caesar. Whereas they just admitted, okay, well, it's not actually because of this, it's because he claimed to be the Son of God. But now they're going back to the original claim, hey, he's looking to be a worldly authority, where Jesus just admitted that he's not. So obviously Pilate knows that this is bunk because he already had that conversation with Jesus. But there's a different spiritual issue going on in the background. So the spiritual issue is the Jews, rather than looking to God as the ultimate authority and the Son of God or his Messiah, would be the one that they would therefore get their direction and authority from. They actually want to have a worldly authority give them direction, and they're appealing to a worldly authority, and it's Caesar. So they're forsaking the heavenly for the worldly in terms of authority and power. Whereas Pilate was actually flipping that, and when he heard that Jesus might be a heavenly authority, he's more what's the word that I'm looking for? I can't find it. So he's relatively more open to hearing Jesus out if he is a divine authority, and that could trump the worldly authority for him. So the Jews are kind of going the opposite direction you would expect, and the Gentile is open to this. But what added issue do you think there would be for Jews to appeal to Caesar? Jews appealing to Caesar. They're rejecting God, looking to worldly authority. What other issue would you see there? Spiritual issue.
Rejecting God.
Well, yeah, they were rejecting God.
Rejecting Messiah.
Okay, so would Caesar be open to a Jewish Messiah?
As we understand Messiah, not as the Jews were.
But would Caesar be open to a Jewish Messiah?
He wanted to be king. He didn't want anybody else to be king.
That's late reign Tiberius. More Tiberius ended up killing quite a few people in his late reign. So I could say yes to that. But if we're looking to a spiritual issue, maybe I'll rephrase this slightly. Would Caesar believe in a Jewish Messiah?
He just lumped in with all the other gods.
Possibly. Most likely, who would he actually be appealing to? Caesar. Who would Caesar be appealing to? Okay. Yeah, so I would draw a picture of the Mediterranean, but that would probably take too long. Okay. So we'll put Caesar here. Okay. So he wants to believe in somebody. So would he believe in Yahweh, this desert / sky god of the Israelites, this one Roman province off to the side of his empire? Or would he believe in sorry, I have to translate this to Roman names. Jupiter or Neptune, or because Jupiter would be the all-round apex of their pantheon. He'd also be sky deity. Neptune would be sea, and when you have the Mediterranean there, you probably want a sea god there. But you also be praying to Mercury, who's would also be the god of trade, which you'd also really like to have around the sea. And then you'd also have Mars in there for god of war, because you're constantly trying to defend the fringes of your empire. And I could go on and on and on. So would Caesar readily incorporate this deity, who's worshipped in this small little podunk province off to the side, or would he try to worship these gods who are worshipped almost universally around the Mediterranean area?
The many gods.
Yeah. Why would he care about this one?
He has no knowledge of that one, probably.
Probably, actually, yeah, because if we're looking to Roman sources, the first time you really get a lot of conversation about this is the Jewish writer Josephus. So Josephus, he wrote a few different books. One of them was the Antiquities, and the Antiquities, in large part, was Josephus's summary of the Bible. That was the first time that there was a popular understanding of Judaism across the Roman Empire, because nobody encountered this or heard about it before. Most of them, anyways. And Josephus, care to guess when he was writing? Before or after Jesus? That's right, after. So yes, the vast majority of the Roman Empire would have had no ability to have heard about this at all, which is also why the Pharisaical efforts to try and create synagogues across the empire was such a major thing. Like, they were trying to make converts, and like those were small societies off to the side. Like, you'd have, because when say like St. Paul is touring around about 20-30 years after Jesus, he's visiting all these synagogues first in whatever town he's going to. So those were absolutely essential for any sort of a movement to bring the word of Christ and, well, God in general to the people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have really heard about this. So you had the Pharisees doing that, but as for major writings where intellectuals or nobility could really hear about this, you don't have that until Josephus. And that's, well, even another 20-something years after Paul, that Josephus writes this down, because Josephus' first book, The Jewish War, that's mid-70s AD. And that's just basically talking about the time that, well, the Jews got wiped off the map because they started a fight with Rome. So that, and then people are like, well, wait, who are the Jews? And then Josephus had to write the Antiquities, which kind of summarize the Bible to explain what they actually believe.
But don't you think that when they were saying, if you let him go, you're in front of Caesar, that like personal preservation is kicked in, like the fear of what would happen to him personally?
Yes,
if
absolutely.
that- Yeah.
Yeah, but the Jews, but so when John's mentioning this, we have that kind of on the surface level, if you will, that we're concerned about Pilate, that this is a spiritual battle within, well, maybe not spiritual, political battle with Pilate. But what John is trying to bring up is there's spiritual warfare going on, and there's spiritual warfare within Pilate. And that's what I've been trying to kind of bring up a little bit more, where Pilate is actually open to believing that Jesus might be the son of a god, at least this god, because Pilate's been in this province for a while now, so he'd have an idea of like basic ideas of who this is. And Pilate would most likely go like, yeah, sure, maybe we put a shrine to this god somewhere. Why not? So Pilate, like he would be open to at least hearing about, well, what's really going on with this person on a spiritual level. But the Jews are making a different spiritual claim. Because the Jews, when they're appealing to this God and saying, if you're rejecting this guy who claims to be Messiah, so I'll put Messiah / Christ. As Messiah is the Hebrew term, Christ is the Greek term. So if you're accepting Jesus as the Messiah, as somebody here, then you're no friend of Caesar. So the Jews are actually making a spiritual confession themselves, where they're saying it is better to be a friend of this pagan Gentile worshiping these false gods than it is trying to follow this guy who claims to be Jesus, the Christ. So John's bringing this up to show that there's a spiritual depravity of the people, that they're not just they're just not in unbelief, they're not in ignorance, they are actively appealing to this guy to worship these gods, who worships these gods, and we're also going to be finding that Tiberius will apotheosize. I can't remember if this happened before he died or after he died. I'm pretty sure it happened after he died. But since there was already beginning to be a trend where the Roman emperors were, like with Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, Tiberius was the third emperor. So when you have Tiberius die, the people claim that he's a god now within their own religion. So when the Jews are claiming, let's look to this guy who would most likely be claimed to be a god, and we need to be his friend, they're already starting to reject their own faith. So John's trying to show, like, yes, they are making a faith claim. It's not just a political claim, it's a faith claim. And we would more readily understand this if we lived about 400 years ago, because during the Enlightenment, there is more of a separation between political and spiritual beliefs. Okay. Maybe I'll do this to help illustrate the point. Okay. All right. All right. So we have anybody who claims this is not a friend of Caesar. So at this point in time, Has Jesus said anything against Caesar?
No,
No,
No. And therefore Pilate has not heard Jesus say anything against Caesar. Jesus did say, my kingdom's not of this world. So Pilate has absolutely no grounds to say that he would be removing himself from allegiance to Caesar if he should exonerate Jesus. However, if we have an emperor who's saying, hey, we should worship all these gods, would Jesus actually be in favor of that?
no.
No. So implicitly, there is a separation between this and like between following God, like the one true God Yahweh, with his Messiah Jesus Christ, and following this. So if let's say Canada decides to become an empire, I don't know, the Liberal Party gets a majority and they go way off the deep end for some reason, I don't know. So they decide, well, let's make the Empire of Canada, and now we follow the Quebecois and make an absolutely secular state. So secularism is now our god. Let us bow down before bureaucracy and worship bureaucracy. I don't know. I'm making up a weird scenario. Okay.
I have a question,
Yeah.
Pastor. Apothesized, I do not
Apotheosize.
apotheosize.
Yeah. So apostatize is when you fall away from faith. Apotheosize is when somebody is made into a god. Yeah. Okay. So going to the scenario, Empire of Canada, bureaucracy is now our god. So following the state is your god. We as Christians, if we're trying to submit to the government, which we're called to do in the scriptures, does that mean that now we have to worship the state? Worship bureaucracy?
no,
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 no. We'd be living in a nation that does look to this sort of worship, but we do not ourselves do this thing, because this is quite clearly against God's law. We should submit to the government in the sense that, yes, we want to do God's will to have proper law and order in our land, but that does not mean that we should follow whatever sin is being preached. So with this, Jesus would absolutely say, yeah, submit to Caesar, or render to Caesar what is Caesar. So Jesus has said, like earlier this week, that he's being crucified. He said on, so this is Friday, he said on the Tuesday, pay your taxes to Caesar. So Jesus is obviously saying, like, yes, follow this government. But Jesus is not saying, yeah, worship all the gods that the government tells you to worship. So we're seeing some difference. So Jesus isn't fully backing that government, but he's also not fully opposing it. So and Jesus would also, like, he's also implicitly saying that it's also wrong to kill an innocent man because he's telling Pilate you're committing the sin. So there is some issues going on here, but yeah, what we would hope to have is a submission this way. Okay, so oppose to Caesar. So Jesus, yeah, does not oppose Caesar. His kingdom is something beyond that. He doesn't agree with everything Caesar does, but Jesus does still want us to submit to those who are in authority as long as they are governing correctly, according to God's will. Okay. So moving on to verse 13. So when Pilate heard this, and at this point in time, he probably has heard it a number of different times because he's been trying to set Jesus free, so that's an ongoing action. So most likely the people are just repeating this again and again and again. So after a while, Pilate, he decided to bring Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the safe stone pavement, which NIV is saying in Aramaic is Gabata. And yes, that is the proper way to pronounce it. That's right. I'll do a brief linguistics lesson. Get rid of all these nasty gods. Okay. Okay. I should go with this one. Okay. So, place is called the stuff. Throw that's Lampo. And I have to put this in the proper tense, so that would be close. No. That would be in that one. That would be you. Sorry.
So were the planets named after the gods? Was the gods after the planets?
Planets after gods. Lithos Strotos. So that literally means stone place or road tiles. And then John uses the word in Hebrew because there wasn't really a good way to have a distinction between Hebrew and Aramaic in the Greek language. So John says in Hebrew, but Gabata is actually an Aramaic word. So we're just going to put slash Aramaic. So Gabata. So in Hebrew and Aramaic, there's no the sound. It doesn't exactly exist. Maybe some later forms of Hebrew have it, but not now. So they don't have a th sound. So the th sound is kind of a breathy t. So similar to German, where you do have a
Soft T and a sharp T.
yeah, because a th in German isn't a th, it's a th. Yeah. So same basic idea with this. So and yeah, Gabata is pretty much a straightforward translation of this. Stone, well, you could say pavement or tiles, just something paved. And these only appear here in the entirety of scripture. They only appear here, but we tend to remember it because this is the text that we have year after year after year on Good Friday. But otherwise, no. But yes, I wanted to highlight the pronunciation. But Gabata could also refer to hill of the house. Lithostrotos could also be a mosaic. Gabata could be hill of the house, but you could also just have straightforward translations of both of them. It's weird. So in the geography of the place, this could possibly refer to the courtyard of the Antonia fortress. So this is the fortress of Herod on the northwest corner of the Jerusalem temple. And this would most likely have been where Herod was. So when Jesus was being tried by Pilate, there's the scene where Jesus was taken away to go before Herod. And then he came back to Pilate. Yeah, so most likely this was at this fortress. So they went over to this fortress to put Jesus before Herod, then he came back. And now it could possibly be, because again, these words only appear here in the scriptures. So we're guessing where this is, but it could be in the courtyard of this particular palace. So they might have gone back to this palace where Herod would be. So Herod might have had front row seats to this, or he might not have cared and didn't watch it at all. In any case, this had the Antonia fortress, the courtyard has a Roman pavement, and the fortress itself is on the rocky outcropping, so it meets both the criteria of hill on the house and mosaic. So most likely, yeah, Pilate is going to the judgment seat there. So in the courtyard of a government official's palace, yeah, that would be more or less where you'd have some of the public affairs, which includes judgments. But one of the interesting things, because there's so many interesting things, is the judgment seat isn't the judgment seat. Now, in English, we put the judgment seat because that makes sense. But the Greek doesn't have a definite article. And you're like, what's the definite article? The definite article for English is the. We also have indefinite articles. Indefinite articles are a and an. So there's a big difference if I say a felt pen and the felt pen. Because if I say the felt pen, I mean this felt pen. If I say a felt pen, I'm giving you the idea. Oh yeah, any felt pen. So in the biblical passages, it's indefinite. Judgment seat is indefinite. So we don't know exactly which judgment seat we're talking about. And there's even a suggestion that it's a portable judgment seat. So you're bringing it out and putting it here so that you can make a legal judgment from the seat of judgment right there. So again, we don't know exactly where this declaration is being made. Most likely it is the fortress where Herod is residing. Okay. All right. Any other little questions about verse 13? The Pilate going to the judgment seat.
So
Nope.
this trial of before Pilate, like it would be multiple locations, or do you think it all happened at these Antonia?
No, because they went. Excuse me. So they absolutely sorted out where Pilate is residing, and that's referred to as the Praetorium. So Praetorium would be where Roman soldiers would reside in Jerusalem, and that would be also for protection of Pilate. So Pilate is there for judgment as well as security. So they absolutely brought Jesus to him first. And partway through, Jesus heard, Pilate heard Jesus is a Galilean. So he went, let's give him over to Herod. And then Herod went, ooh, perform a miracle for me. Oh, wait, you're not doing it. You're boring. And then he sends him back to Pilate. At which point Pilate goes, that was kind of funny, let's be friends. And Pilate still recognizes, but I have to free this Jesus guy somehow. So this is when he goes back to the crowd, says, do you want Jesus? And then the people go, hey, no, we want Barabbas. And then you have that exchange. That's when the people let it slip. Oh, yeah, but he has to die. We can't let him free because he's said to be the Son of God. And then you have the exchange inside the Praetorium again, or most likely inside the Praetorium. And now Pilate has gone out. Jesus most likely still inside, but Pilate has gone out. Trying to get the crowd to to exonerate Jesus. And now this is the part of the confusion is, are we still there at the Praetorium, or did we move back over to the Antonia fortress where Herod is? So it could be either one. So Pilate, if he's giving an official declaration, he might have decided to go to the more official place, which would be the Antonia Palace or Antonia Fortress, sorry. Or he could have gone or stayed at the Praetorium. What's the difference? One's more Roman, the other is more Jewish. That's basically the difference. Okay. So verse 14. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. This leads to a whole bunch of questions, actually. So you may recall months ago, probably not, but months ago, I kind of brought up, oh, there's a bit of a discrepancy when it comes to the date, because when you have the Last Supper, obviously the Last Supper is happening with the day, the Feast of Passover. And the Feast of Passover is when you would sacrifice the lamb. So Jesus, when he's giving his body and blood to the disciples there, like that is his sacrifice of himself. That he as lamb is already as good as dead. Therefore, he is giving them his body. He is giving them his blood to eat and drink as they would have eaten and drunk the lamb. Well, they wouldn't have drunk the lamb, but they would have eaten the lamb. So the sacrifice seems to have occurred then. And then Jesus, when he's giving them his body and his blood, like this, the actual offering of body and blood won't be for another day and when he's on the cross, but Jesus transcends time with meal, which is how we still receive his body and blood through the meal. He transcends time. So obviously this is the Passover meal. But now John is saying in this verse, it's the day of preparation, so the day leading up to the sacrifice of the lambs at the temple. Okay. So when I was going through that before, I was trying to explain there are multiple ways that this has been explained in the past. And one of the most likely ways that this is actually occurring is that there are two calendar systems being used. So Jesus is going by an older calendar, at which point he is absolutely having the Passover meal on when it should happen. But the other calendar, which is a more Pharisaical calendar, that is out by a day for this year. So they're sacrificing it later on, the animals later on. So that's one way to explain it. So when Jesus is on the cross, that's when they're actually sacrificing animals at the temple, the lambs at the temple. So that's one way to explain it. Another way to explain it is, well, maybe they are using the same calendar system, but the day of preparation is being counted from evening to evening. So the Pharisees are at, well, the Sanhedrin in general. So the leaders of Israel, they knew that they'd be killing Jesus, so they don't want to be made unclean for that. And they're trying to be ready for this, so they don't have time to take part of the meal. So they're treating it as one day from evening Thursday to evening Friday. So they're going to have the meal not at twilight, but at some time before the twilight of the next day when it turns into the day that they can actually have the meal. So those are the two possible explanations, or best possible explanations. Okay. But now we have an issue with the time of day. Yay! So in verse 14 it says, about the 6th hour. When was this? When was the 6th hour?
6 after sunrise.
There we go. So we have the question of, we won't be using this anymore because we'll move through this the preceding verse. So let's have 6 hour. So if we're counting from sunrise, we'll say that this is now noon. And so 6 hours from here. So this would be the Jewish system of counting. Okay. Now, if we're using a Roman system of counting, I'll put it forward here. A Roman system of counting, this is about 6 a.m. That'll be Roman. Yes. So there's a bit of discussion as to whether John meant the Jewish counting or the Roman counting. And what complicates this is in St. Mark. So in the Gospel of Mark, you have a mention of the sentencing of Jesus at the third hour. Which would, well, and Mark pretty much exclusively uses Jewish counting. So this would be 9 a.m. So John gives us a bit of a question, which system is he using? But Mark, no, he's using Jewish, like that's just straightforward. So Jesus' sentence is about here, but John is saying, well, this happened at 6 a.m. or noon. Ergo, huh? Okay, what's going on? Excuse me. So what could actually be happening is that they're using the same counting system, so we got noon and 9 a.m. And what seems to be happening is that, or sorry, no, different counting system. So John would be on the 6 a.m., Mark would be on 9 a.m. And John is saying, well, a lot of the events have been happening more towards the night, more in the night. And what's going on here is this is the last part of the trial that's going on. And Jesus doesn't actually get to the cross until a few hours later. And that it could be a way to view it is that John is talking about, well, this is just the end of the trial, and Mark is picking up at this is when he's crucified. Okay.
How does the Roman calendar compare to the Jewish calendars?
Very different. Because Roman calendar is, well, at this point in time, it's also really screwed up. So we're using a Roman calendar now, but our Roman calendar has been updated multiple times that it actually functions. For the sake of example, what month are we in?
October.
October. So what number of month? 10th month. What does the prefix oct mean in terms of numbers?
8.
8. Wait, why do we have the 8th month of the year for the 10th month? Well, that's because the Romans had to add a couple of months because their calendar was so screwed up. Yeah, so we do follow the Roman calendar for the most part, but it's been updated multiple times. So the Roman calendar is the solar calendar, and we absolutely do use the solar calendar because we're marking this pretty distinctly, and we're doing it by the revolution of the sun around the earth. But the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, and it shifts a lot. Because the moon doesn't really follow the sun, because the moon has 28 point something days for rotation versus solar calendar, which can be more easily divided up.
So the Passover wouldn't be translated onto the Roman calendar in any way. It's
So-
kind of like our Easter, it keeps moving.
Well, our Easter has a different backstory. I covered that in the early Christian history study that I had with the Nicene Council, because that was one of the minor issues that they were dealing with. Is, hey, let's have Easter at the same time, and then but they said, okay, well, we'll have the same time for both the Alexandrian Church and the Roman Church. We'll have Easter at the same time because those churches had it at the same time. Not realizing that those two churches had Easter at different times of the year. So there's an Eastern Easter and a Western Easter. Anyway, fun. So Easter changes because it was trying to follow somewhat of a Jewish counting system, but it was based on tradition, which partially lunar, yes. And I say partially.
Can we be sure, pardon me, that Easter falls in the springtime? When you're talking about the 6th hour, and that makes sense if Easter is in the spring.
But
I don't know.
Like in summertime, it's daylight at 4 a.m.
No, okay, so
for us,
Yeah.
so
but
their hours change the length depending on the time of year. Because you'd always have the same hours of daylight for the day. And this also goes to different counting systems, because sometimes they did have more like the Roman, which was more segmented. But for other calendar systems, they're changing the length of the hour depending on how much daylight there was.
so Israel was sort of getting towards the equatorial, so you don't have the seasonal change from 8:30.
Yeah, you wouldn't have huge differences, but you could go from, say, like an hour being 45 minutes to an hour being like 75 minutes, something like that. It depended on the time of year, because you would always have like 12 hours daylight. Again, very different from the systems we use today.
So we don't really know when Easter was, or we do know.
That depends on the time of the year that Jesus was crucified. So the generally accepted year is 33 AD. But since this is looking after Passover, which is determined by a lunar calendar, this changes every single year. So when we look at the times that you have the Passover feast fall on a Friday, that appears in 33 AD, 34 AD, and then I think it's also 20 AD. So the generally accepted date or year is 33 AD. Generally accepted. But there is a possibility of variation with that. So do we know the exact time? Well, not unless they're actually interested in writing down the date for us, and we actually discover this at some point in time in a future archaeological dig. Yeah. The greater religious symbology is, well, we want to at least follow the festal calendar of the Old Testament, because Jesus was crucified on the first day of the Passover. He was in the tomb on the Sabbath day, so he rested on the Sabbath. And then the Sunday, which is the first day after the Sabbath following the beginning of Passover, that is the Feast of First Fruits, where Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And then if you have a week of weeks, so 7 times 7, a week of weeks from that, then that is the feast of, oh no, I'm blanking on the term. I'm only getting the Greek one. Oh no, it is the Feast of Weeks. What am I talking about? So we have the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, and then that's when the Holy Spirit comes. So for our Christian point of view, what really matters is the conformity with the Israelite calendar, not with a solar calendar like we use today. Yeah. We're also very much in the Western mindset where we like things the same every single year versus some Eastern or African or island or wherever it happens to be, where people are not as particular about exact times. But we're Lutherans and we're German or Scandinavian and we want things on time. That's what we want.
Organization.
Exactly, yeah. So then, yeah, we as with our Lutheran background, we could read this and we go like, "Wow, no, why is what's going on? Why?" But other cultures would read this and they would bat an eye. In any case, so it could be the case that John is using more of this counting system. And he's saying that the trial is ending around this time, and Mark is saying, well, it takes Jesus some time to get to the cross. Another possible solution is that they're just using approximate times, so they're dividing the day into quarters. So John is saying, yeah, it was around the 6th hour, and Mark is saying, yeah, it's around the 3rd hour. So therefore, it's sometime between 9 a.m. and noon, or 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. So they could just be saying, yeah, it's around this time, which is fair enough because you don't have wristwatches in those days. So you just go like, around this time. So another suggestion is another suggestion was Mark wasn't being absolutely literal when he said 6th hour, 3rd hour. He actually meant more 3rd watch of the day, which is the watches that you have for Roman soldiers, which is actually denoting noon and after. So you could have meant 3rd hour as 3rd watch, which would have actually been at noon. But yeah, there's no real reason why anybody should really accept that because Mark hasn't had anywhere else in this gospel where he suggests that he's following Roman soldiers. And I just want to mention this one because it's been put forth, but I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to it. Where people who are writing or copying the gospels, they're confused between this and this. So this is gamma, or capital gamma, and this is the Greek numeral for 6. This is an F, which doesn't actually have the Greek letter attached to it. But this is a numeral for the Greeks. And this would be the Greek numeral for 9. So it's been suggested that when people were copying down the text, they messed up and they read this as this. I don't support this theory because that would suggest that people are not paying attention at all to the biblical text. And if this were the case, what we would actually expect to find would be like multiple manuscripts of the Gospel of John. Some would have this, some would have that. Because if this was a copyist error, like this would happen later on, not with all the copies that we ever had. So I don't think that this is good theory. Most likely, I would say they're just giving an approximate time, or there's a difference in that John's looking more to when it began, Mark is looking more towards when it ends. I say those would be bad ones. Okay. Any questions about the differences in time between John and Mark? Good. good. Okay, I just wanted to cover that. Just in case you were reading things and you're like, hey, Pastor, what's going on with this? So very, very quickly, I just want to cover the end of verse 14 there. So Pilate then says, here's your king. So this is another presentation that Pilate has of Jesus. He did this before. It happened with Barabbas, where Jesus was brought out. Pilate was saying, do you really want me to crucify the king of the Jews? And people said, yeah, crucify him, we want Barabbas. But the second time was when Pilate had Jesus scourged and decorated with the thorns and the cloak. And then he brought Jesus out again and he says, behold the man, behold your king. And then they say, yeah, no, it's not that he claimed to be king, he claimed to be the Son of God. Then Pilate has another exchange with Jesus. And now this third time, Pilate is bringing Jesus out to say, to say that this is your king. So this is the third time that it's happening. 3. Wonder what also happened 3 times. Well, anyways, probably important. I would like to explore that, but yeah, we're well past noon right now. So is there anything immediate that you would like to talk about with Pilate presenting Jesus again? Here is your king. Or... No. Okay, so we'll cover that next time, and we'll wrap up a little bit of talk with Pilate before Jesus is sent off to the cross next week. Okay. So let's pray. Lord God Almighty, you have set everybody who is in authority into their positions, and we ask you, O Lord, that they govern wisely and according to your will. Please be with all those in authority, whether they're ruling over nations or provinces or even households, so that they may govern wisely and do what is best for the people under their care. We especially ask you to look after us as we are under your care, under the care of our true King, Jesus Christ, that you do what is good and well for us as we live in the world that you have set before us. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.